September 16, 1997, Cupertino, California. A man walks into a boardroom. He's wearing his signature black turtleneck and jeans. In his hand, a single piece of paper. The company he's about to address is 90 days from bankruptcy, worth less than $3 billion, bleeding cash, losing relevance, dying. That man is Steve Jobs, and in his hand, a plan so radical, so insane, that it will either save the company or destroy it completely. 24 years later, that dying company would become the first in history to reach $3 trillion in value. This is the story of Apple, and nothing about it is what you think. Apple, the empire built on rebellion. Let's rewind. 1976, Los Altos, California. Everyone knows the story. Two Steves in a garage, building computers that would change the world. But here's what they don't tell you. Steve Jobs didn't know how to code. He wasn't an engineer. He couldn't build computers. In fact, he was a college dropout who'd spent the previous year walking around India barefoot, experimenting with LSD, and following a fruitarian diet so extreme he thought he didn't need to shower. Weird? Absolutely, but also strategic, because Jobs understood something nobody else in Silicon Valley did. It wasn't about the technology, it was about the experience. His partner, Steve Wozniak, brilliant engineer, actual genius, had just built something revolutionary, a personal computer with a keyboard and screen. Before this, computers were massive machines that filled entire rooms. But Wozniak wanted to give the design away for free, to share it with his hobbyist club. Jobs saw something different. He saw the future. And he was about to make a deal that would change everything. But it required betraying the one person who trusted him most. His friend, Ronald Wayne. Wayne was the adult in the room, the experienced one. When Apple Computer Company was founded on April 1, 1976, 3 people signed the partnership agreement. Steve Jobs, 45%, Steve Wozniak, 45%, Ronald Wayne, 10%. Wayne designed the first logo, wrote the manual, everything. He was essentially the COO. But Jobs was volatile, aggressive. He'd already convinced a local computer store to order 50 units, computers they hadn't even built yet, for $50,000. He borrowed $15,000 to buy parts with zero backup plan. Wayne panicked. He was older, had assets, and knew that in a partnership he'd be personally liable if this crazy scheme failed. 12 days later, Ronald Wayne sold his 10% stake in Apple for $800. Today, that stake would be worth approximately $300 billion, the biggest financial mistake in human history. But Jobs wasn't done making controversial decisions. In fact, his next move would create one of the most iconic brands ever by stealing from Xerox. December 1979. Steve Jobs and his team visit Xerox PARC, the research facility where some of the smartest minds in tech worked. Xerox shows them everything: the graphical user interface, the mouse, the desktop metaphor, the future of computing, fully functional. And Xerox just let them see it. Why? They didn't think personal computers would ever be profitable. They were a photocopier company. Jobs walked out of that building, turned to his team, and said, "They're sitting on a gold mine and they don't even know it." He immediately ordered his team to replicate everything. When Xerox later accused Apple of stealing, Jobs would famously say, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." In 1984, Apple launched the Macintosh with a $1.5 million Super Bowl commercial, directed by Ridley Scott, the most famous ad ever made.
It positioned Apple as the rebel, the alternative, the weapon against conformity and Big Brother, a not-so-subtle jab at IBM. The Macintosh was beautiful, revolutionary, friendly. It was also a commercial failure. Sales dropped, the company fractured, Jobs became impossible to work with, screaming at employees, crying during presentations, parking in handicapped spots because he thought he was special. The board had enough. And in 1985, in one of the most traumatic corporate betrayals in history, Steve Jobs was fired from the company he founded by the man he hired, the man he trusted, John Sculley.
Imagine this. You create a company in your parents' garage. You pour your soul into it. You name it, you brand it, you fight for it. And then they take it away from you. Steve Jobs didn't just lose his job, he lost his identity. At 30 years old, he was a millionaire, but humiliated, cast out, labeled as toxic, unmanageable, a liability. Most people would have disappeared, retired to a beach somewhere. Jobs did the opposite. He started Next Computer, a new company building high-end workstations for universities. Beautiful machines, expensive, elegant, and almost nobody bought them. Next was a commercial disaster, but it was building something else, something invisible, an operating system, software, architecture, something Apple would desperately need years later. Jobs also bought a small animation studio from George Lucas for $5 million. He had no idea what to do with it, he just liked the technology. That studio was called Pixar. And while Next was failing, Pixar was quietly creating the first fully computer-animated feature film in history. In 1995, Toy Story was released. It made $373 million. Overnight, Steve Jobs, the failure, the outcast, became a billionaire. But he wasn't satisfied, because the company he truly loved, the one that cast him out, was dying. By 1996, Apple was in free fall. Microsoft had won. Windows was everywhere. Apple's market share had collapsed to less than 4%. The company was experimenting with dozens of products, printers, cameras, PDAs. None of them worked. They cycled through CEOs, nothing helped. Then, desperately, the board realized something. They needed an operating system, a modern one, and they had no idea how to build it. So they looked outside, and there it was, Next. Steve Jobs' failed computer company with the exact software Apple needed. In December 1996, Apple acquired Next for $429 million, and with it, they brought back Steve Jobs as an advisor. Within 6 months, he'd staged a quiet coup, forced out the CEO, and seized control. Steve Jobs was back, and he was about to do something nobody expected.
August 6, 1997, Macworld, Boston. Steve Jobs walks on stage. He's not officially the CEO, just the interim leader, but everyone knows who's in charge. The company's bleeding $1 billion a year, 90 days of cash left. He has no room for error. And then he says the unthinkable. We need to let go of the notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose. The crowd boos. Then the screen behind him lights up. Bill Gates, live via satellite, looming over the audience like Big Brother himself. Jobs had just made a deal with the enemy. Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple and continue making Office for Mac. The crowd is furious. They feel betrayed. But Jobs knew something they didn't. Apple didn't need to beat Microsoft. Not yet. They needed to survive. And then they needed to become something entirely different. Jobs' first move? Simplify. Apple had 350 products. He cut them down to 4. 4 computers. That's it. Then he killed the Newton, the printers, the peripherals, everything that distracted from the core. Employees were terrified, but the company stopped bleeding cash. Next, he needed a product that would remind the world why Apple mattered. In 1998, Apple launched the iMac, a translucent, colorful, all-in-one computer that looked like it came from the future. It was playful, fun, different. Tech reviewers mocked it. No floppy drive? What kind of computer has no floppy drive? Consumers loved it. The iMac sold 800,000 units in the first 5 months. It saved Apple. But Jobs wasn't done, because in a secret lab in Cupertino, a small team was working on something that had nothing to do with computers. Something that would change everything.
October 23, 2001. Steve Jobs stands on stage, reaches into his pocket, and pulls out a small white device. 1,000 songs in your pocket, he says. The iPod. At $399, it was expensive. It only worked with Macs, and MP3 players already existed. Tech journalists called it a flop, but Apple understood something the others didn't. It wasn't about technology. It was about desire. The iPod was beautiful. The wheel was intuitive. The white earbuds became a status symbol. And in 2003, Apple launched the iTunes Store, legal music downloads for 99 cents. Record labels had resisted digital music for years, terrified of piracy. But Jobs convinced them, and suddenly buying music became easier than stealing it. By 2007, Apple had sold over 100 million iPods. The company that almost died was now the leader in consumer electronics. But Jobs was paranoid. He knew someone, someday, would build a device that combined a phone, an iPod, and the Internet. And when that happened, the iPod would die. So he made a decision. Apple would kill its own best-selling product by creating something even better. For 2 years, a secret team worked in a locked lab. Security was extreme. NDAs were brutal. Even most Apple employees had no idea what was being built. The project was called Project Purple. The goal? A phone with no buttons, just a screen, touch-controlled, revolutionary. But there was a problem. The technology barely worked. The software crashed constantly. The battery died in hours. The screen scratched easily. Engineers told Jobs it wasn't ready. Jobs didn't care. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked on stage at Macworld and said, "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." He unveiled the iPhone, and the world changed.
The iPhone wasn't just a phone. It was a camera, an iPod, a web browser, a handheld computer. It had no keyboard, no stylus, just your finger and a piece of glass. Competitors laughed. Steve Ballmer, CEO of Microsoft, literally laughed on camera. It's the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers. BlackBerry's CEO said it would never succeed. Nokia called it a toy. Within 5 years, BlackBerry and Nokia were nearly bankrupt. The iPhone didn't just dominate the phone market, it created a new market. Apps, mobile internet, social media, the entire smartphone era. Apple didn't just win, it redefined the game. By 2011, the iPhone was generating more revenue than all of Microsoft. Apple became the most valuable company in the world. But behind the scenes, something terrible was happening. Steve Jobs was dying. In 2003, he'd been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. For months, he refused surgery, trying alternative treatments, juice cleanses, acupuncture, spiritual healing. By the time he agreed to the operation, it was too late. He kept working, kept pushing, kept presenting, but his body was failing. On August 24, 2011, Steve Jobs resigned as CEO of Apple.
6 weeks later, on October 5, 2011, he died. He was 56 years old. And the world asked the same question: can Apple survive without Steve Jobs?
Tim Cook became CEO, a supply chain expert, calm, methodical, the exact opposite of Steve Jobs. Critics predicted disaster. Apple's innovation is dead, they said. Without Jobs, they're just another tech company. But something unexpected happened. Apple thrived. Tim Cook didn't try to be Steve Jobs. He focused on execution, operations, scale. Under his leadership, the iPhone became the best-selling product in history. Apple launched the Apple Watch. Services, App Store, iCloud, Apple Music became a $50 billion business. Apple's stock price increased by over 1,000%. In 2018, Apple became the first trillion-dollar company. In 2020, $2 trillion. In 2022, $3 trillion. But the criticism never stopped. Where's the innovation? Where's the next iPhone? They're just making incremental updates. And yet, people keep buying. Why? Because Apple understood the ultimate truth of business. It's not about the product, it's about the ecosystem. Once you buy an iPhone, you get an Apple Watch, AirPods, a MacBook, an iPad. Everything works together, seamlessly. You're not buying a device, you're joining a tribe. And tribes are powerful. Today, Apple is worth over $3 trillion, more than Amazon and Google combined. It has over 2 billion active devices worldwide. It's the most valuable brand on Earth. But the question remains, what's next? Apple is betting big on augmented reality and the Vision Pro headset, AI integration across all devices, health technology, turning the Apple Watch into a medical device, electric vehicles, maybe. The company that started in a garage, that nearly died, that was saved by a man they fired, is now shaping the future of humanity. But here's the real lesson of Apple's story. It's not about technology. It's about the vision. Steve Jobs didn't invent computers, MP3 players, or smartphones. He made them desirable. He understood that people don't buy products. They buy stories, identities, dreams. Apple didn't sell computers. It sold rebellion. It sold creativity. It sold the idea that you, yes, you, could think differently. And that is why a logo of a bitten apple became the most recognized symbol on the planet. So that's the story of Apple, from a garage in Sal Altos to a $3 trillion empire. A story of genius and betrayal, of exile and return, of a man who changed the world and the company that survived without him. But Apple's story isn't over, and neither is this series. Next episode, we're diving into another empire, one that started by selling books online and ended up selling everything. We're talking about Amazon, the story of Jeff Bezos, a man who slept on a mattress in his office while building a company that would reshape global commerce. It's a story of ambition, ruthlessness, and a relentless obsession with the customer. You do not want to miss it. So if you enjoyed this video, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell so you don't miss the next episode. Drop a comment and let me know what surprised you most about Apple's story. And if you want to support this channel, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching Global Entrepreneurs Archives. And remember, the best stories aren't about companies. They're about the people crazy enough to change the world. See you in the next one.